An elderly cowboy walked into an auction and suddenly recognized a horse stolen from him 10 years ago. When a worn-out cowboy pointed at a half-starved horse at a rural auction and whispered, "That's mine, from 10 years ago," everyone froze. No one believed him until the horse did something that stunned the entire crowd. The winter wind had a way of sweeping through Hartwell Ridge as if it were searching for something long forgotten. Snow clung to the fences and the rusted roofs of the old auction barns, turning the whole valley into a muted watercolor of white and ash gray. Caleb Mercer tightened the worn collar of his coat as he stepped out of the pickup, boots sinking into the brittle crust of ice. For years he'd avoided crowds, places where memories might cling to him like frost on glass. But some quiet tug deep in his bones, had brought him here today. He hadn't planned on attending the county rescue auction. Most days he simply repaired fences for nearby ranchers, drank his black coffee, and watched the ridges fade into dusk. But early that morning, over the scratchy speaker of a weathered radio, he'd heard the announcer mention a batch of impounded horses, animals pulled from abandoned properties and troubled pastures, set to be sold as is. The phrase lingered in his mind longer than it should. Something about it stirred a place in him he'd tried hard to keep sealed. As he approached the holding pens, the sharp scent of hay and cold iron washed over him. Dozens of horses milled around behind chain link and wooden rails, each one with its own story carved into its stance, its scars, the way it shifted under the weight of winter. But none of them mattered. He wasn't looking for a horse. He hadn't looked for one in 10 years, until he saw it. A handler led a thin, dust-covered gelding through the gate and into the auction ring. Its ribs pressed faintly through a coat dulled by neglect, and its hooves struck the frozen dirt with uneven rhythm. The world seemed to fold inward around Caleb, his vision tunneled, breath catching somewhere between disbelief and the ache of memory. The animal lifted its head, revealing a streak of pale ash running along its neck, like smoke captured in motion. Caleb's knees weakened. The name rose in his throat before he could stop it. Ashfall. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in a decade. Hearing it break from his lips felt like dragging a ghost into daylight. He gripped the railing with both hands as the horse moved under the auction lights, its movements weary yet familiar. Hauntingly familiar. The crowd murmured around him, farmers squinting, traders appraising, but their voices blurred into background static. The auctioneer began his chant, fast and rhythmic, numbers dancing through the frigid air. Caleb didn't hear a single one. All he saw was the faint wobble in the horse's step, the notch in its ear, the way its eyes, dark, deep, and, searching, flicked across the pen as though seeking something it had not found in years. A man beside him nudged his elbow. "Poor thing's seen better days," he said casually. "Probably not worth the feed it'll take to keep him alive." Caleb didn't answer. His chest tightened as Ashfall turned, and there, beneath the dull coat and the brittle winter grime, he glimpsed the outline of a scar, a tiny teardrop mark on the left shoulder. A mark no one else would notice. A mark he had cleaned and tended himself when the horse was young and wild and full of summer fire. His breath shook. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. 10 years was a lifetime for a horse. 10 years was enough time for storms, disasters, sales, and secrets to bury any trace of what once was. But some things, some bonds, refused to be buried. Before he knew he was moving, Caleb stepped forward, boots crunching across the icy ground. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence as heads turned toward the older cowboy making his way to the ring. His coat flapped in the wind. His breath came in thin clouds. He could feel every eye on him, the weight of curiosity pressing in. He planted his hands on the cold metal fence. "That's my horse," he said, voice roughened by years of silence. "That's Ashfall." A wave of murmurs swept through the barn. Someone laughed softly. Another whispered something about senility. Caleb didn't hear them. His gaze locked onto the horse, and for the first time in years he felt something stir beneath the layers of frost that had settled over his heart. Ashfall lifted his head again, ears flicking toward the sound of Caleb's voice. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it struck Caleb like lightning. The auctioneer frowned. "Sir, you'll need documentation if you're making a claim." Caleb didn't blink. "Let me get close to him," he said. "Give me 2 minutes." 2 minutes won't change the paperwork," someone muttered. "No," Caleb replied softly, eyes never leaving the horse. "But it might change the truth." And in that frozen barn, where dust met snowfall and the past hovered just out of reach, the story truly began. An old cowboy, a lost horse, and the kind of recognition no contract or bill of sale could ever explain. The words Caleb spoke at the auction hung in the cold air long after the murmurs died down. 2 minutes might change the truth. They echoed through him as he drove back toward Hartwell Ridge, the narrow road winding between ridges dusted with late winter snow. The mountains rose like gray ghosts in the distance, still, solemn, bearing witness to the long stretch of years he had spent drifting through his own kind of winter. Ashfall's appearance had cracked something open inside him, something he hadn't dared to touch in a decade. The heater in his old truck wheezed as he made the final turn toward his cabin. The small wooden home sat alone at the base of the ridge, its roof sagging slightly under a thin layer of ice. He stepped out and paused, letting the silence settle around him. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, filled with memories he had tried to bury beneath chores, routine, and the steady passing of seasons. But tonight, those memories rose again, unbidden, vivid as wildfire smoke. Inside, he lit the small lantern on the counter. Its warm glow revealed the familiar space, the framed map of Montana on the wall, a stack of old veterinary manuals, and a faded photograph tucked under a magnet on the fridge. Caleb pulled it free, brushing a thumb across its surface. There he was, younger and unburdened, standing beside Ashfall, a proud, muscled colt with a mane the color of burnt cedar. His wife, Maren, had taken this picture before the tragedy, before everything changed. She always said Ashfall looked like a horse, carved from the mountains themselves, strong enough to carry a broken world if asked. He swallowed tightly, the ache rising the way it often did when he let himself remember. 10 years. 10 winters of quiet rooms and empty mornings. 10 years without the rhythm of hooves outside the barn or Maren's laughter drifting through their old training arena. Life had folded into something smaller since then. Fewer dreams, fewer risks, just the reliable weight of survival. For men his age, people often talked about life insurance, retirement funds, accident attorneys, and mortgage refinancing, as if planning for the end was easier than facing the past. But none of those things had ever mattered much to Caleb. What he wanted, what he thought he'd lost forever, was meaning. And somehow, impossibly, Ashfall had returned. He set the photograph down and sank into the worn armchair near the window. Outside, a gust of wind swept down the ridge, scattering powdery snow like a veil across the pasture. The last time he had truly allowed himself to hope was the night of the flood. A storm had rolled through the mountains with a fury unlike anything he'd seen, rain falling in torrents, the river swelling until it tore loose from its banks. Their property had been one of the first to take the hit. He remembered the roaring water, the flash of lightning illuminating the paddock, and Ashfall's frantic scream as the fence gave way. Caleb had tried to reach him, pushing through icy water up to his waist, but the current ripped the horse out of sight before he could take 10 steps. Maren had held him back, screaming his name, and for years afterward he wondered whether she had saved his life that night, or simply prolonged his grief. After the flood, everything changed. Their son, Jonah, had been missing on the mountain trail during the storm, and though search crews tried their best, the final news had arrived like a blow that Caleb never truly recovered from. Marin's heart weakened over the months that followed, and by the next winter, Caleb found himself alone in a house filled with echoes. Ashfall's absence became another weight, one more empty space he didn't know how to face. Now, sitting in the quiet cabin, the thought of seeing that same horse again, alive, breathing, looking at him across the auction ring, made the air feel too thin. He pressed a hand against his chest as if the memories were trying to break free from the place he'd locked them. A sudden soft tapping broke the stillness. Branches brushed against the window, swayed by the rising wind. Caleb stood and walked to the door, stepping out onto the small porch. Moonlight spilled across the snow-covered yard, painting everything in silver. The world looked untouched, almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm inside his mind. He imagined Ashfall all as he had been, strong, sure-footed, his coat shining with the deep copper-ash tone Marin loved. The gelding had been more than a horse. He had been part of their family, part of the hope they carried even in difficult seasons. He'd been trained to respond to calm, controlled breathing. 3 steady breaths they used together whenever storms or sudden noises unsettled him. Caleb hadn't used that ritual in 10 years, but at the auction he'd felt it rise naturally, like muscle memory forged in trust. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath form pale clouds in the cold night air. "No," he whispered to himself, "it wasn't my imagination." He looked out toward the distant barn lights of Hartwell Ridge. Somewhere out there, Ashfall was standing alone in a pen, waiting for whatever tomorrow would bring. Whether the courts, the sheriff, or the current claimant believed him didn't matter as much as the truth. Because deep down, he knew the recognition in the horse's eyes wasn't coincidence. A bond like theirs didn't disappear. It endured. As he stepped back inside, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a decade, a quiet spark, faint but real, a spark of resolve. He didn't have documentation. He didn't have papers, receipts, or anything a lawyer might call evidence. But he had the truth. And tomorrow, he would prove it. Before turning out the light, he whispered into the darkness, voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I'm coming back for you, boy." And with that promise, the long-sealed past shifted, opening a path toward everything he thought he'd lost. Morning light stretched thin across the ridge, painting long shadows over Hartwell Ridge as Caleb drove back toward the auction grounds. The cold air felt sharper today, as if the valley itself were bracing for something. He parked near the wooden fence line and stepped out, pulling his coat tight against the wind. His breath drifted upward in a pale ribbon before dissolving into the sky. Every step toward the barn felt heavier, not from doubt, but from the weight of what he needed to do inside. The crowd was thicker than the day before. Word had spread about the old cowboy who claimed a half-starved gelding as his own, about the moment the auction froze when he whispered a name no one else understood. People weren't here to buy. They were here to witness. Conversations hummed around him, quiet but sharp, like the buzz of wires in a winter storm. "That him?" someone murmured. "Yeah, the one who said the rescue horse belonged to him. You think it's true? He's probably lost it. Happens at that age." Caleb kept moving, refusing to let the sting of their words sink in. He'd lived long enough to know people put their faith in paperwork more than memory, and in receipts more than truth. Even in towns built on trust, folks still talked about wills, mortgage protection plans, and liability insurance as if those were the only safeguards life offered. But life didn't always fit inside legal documents. Sometimes the most real things lived in the space between what could be proved and what could be felt. He reached the railings of the main pen just as Sheriff Mark Hollis stepped up beside him. The sheriff's face carried that steady caution he was known for, firm but never unkind. He tipped his hat in acknowledgment. "Morning, Caleb," Hollis said. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Caleb nodded. "I've waited 10 years for a chance like this. I'm not turning back." Hollis studied him a moment, long enough to measure the resolve in the older man's eyes. "All right," he said with a quiet sigh, "but understand, this crowd wants proof, not feelings, not memories, proof." "I'll give them truth," Caleb replied. "They can decide what to call it." A handler led Ashfall into the ring again. The horse looked steadier today, though his ribs still showed beneath the dull coat. His ears flicked nervously, and he sidestepped at the echo of metal chains rattling near the gate. People leaned forward, curious, whispering as Caleb gripped the railing. "Wait here," Hollis instructed, raising a hand to hush the crowd. "Let's keep this orderly." But order was never guaranteed where skepticism lingered. The auctioneer, recognizing an opportunity to keep attention on the spectacle, cleared his throat and announced loudly, "Folks, we've got a situation carried over from yesterday. This man claims the horse is his, gone missing 10 years. We'll let him take his shot, but unless he's got documents, this ain't changing ownership." A ripple of amusement spread across the barn. Someone chuckled. Someone else muttered, "This'll be good." Caleb stepped carefully into the ring, boots touching frozen dirt. Ashfall's head jerked toward him instantly, muscles tensing beneath thin skin. Caleb didn't lift a hand or say the horse's name. He simply stood there, letting the quiet settle. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Caleb said, voice steady, carrying just enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm asking you to watch." A few scoffed. Others fell silent. Even the auctioneer, sensing the gravity of the moment, lowered his gavel. Caleb took one slow step forward. Ashfall shifted, uncertain, nostrils flaring. His tail flicked once, a nervous habit he used to have whenever storms rolled over their ranch. Caleb felt something twist inside him, something old and unhealed, but he held steady. "I raised this horse from the day he touched Montana soil," Caleb said quietly. "I know the way he breathes when he's scared, the way he sets his front hooves before he bolts." You don't forget things like that, not even after 10 years. Someone near the railing scoffed, "Talk's cheap, old man." Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, he reached up and slid his glove off, exposing his hand to the cold. He extended it, not toward Ashfall, but toward the air between them, palm open in a gesture as familiar as sunrise. Ashfall stilled. A hush fell so thick it seemed the wind itself paused outside the barn. Caleb's chest rose and fell gently, once, twice, 3 times. The ritual wasn't a command. It was an invitation, one forged from patience and trust, built long before life turned bitter. Ashfall's ears leaned forward. Then slowly, achingly slowly, the horse stepped toward him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "No way." Another breathed, "I've never seen anything like that." Ashfall approached until his muzzle hovered inches from Caleb's outstretched hand. The horse lowered his head, exhaling warm air across Caleb's skin. A faint tremor passed through Caleb's fingers, but he held steady as Ashfall gently nudged his palm, once, deliberate and soft, as if confirming a memory. Caleb closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in something closer to heartbreak. But the moment shattered abruptly. A voice barked from the far end of the barn, "That horse is mine." Owen Briggs pushed through the crowd, anger flashing across his face. He stomped toward the railing, pointing at Caleb. "I bought him legally. I fed him, housed him. You think a trick like that changes the law?" The crowd stiffened, the tension coiling like barbed wire. Caleb turned slowly, keeping one hand near Ashfall's neck, not touching, just offering calm. "I didn't come here to fight you," he said. "I came here because he remembers." Briggs sneered. "Memory doesn't win court cases. Paperwork does." Sheriff Hollis stepped between them before anyone could escalate. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Both of you, we'll settle this legally." The auctioneer, sensing the moment was no longer entertainment, slammed the gavel down. "All right, folks, horse goes into county custody until the court decides." Ashfall flinched at the bang. Caleb instinctively steadied him with a quiet breath. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with disbelief, curiosity, and the retelling of a moment they knew they'd never forget. Briggs stormed out, muttering curses. Hollis gently guided Caleb toward the exit. "You made an impression today," the sheriff said, "but this isn't over." Caleb glanced back once more at Ashfall, who stood perfectly still, eyes following him with a depth that felt like a plea. "No," Caleb whispered, "it's just beginning." The county rescue barn was quieter in the late afternoon, when most visitors had filtered out, and only the soft creak of rafters filled the space. Sheriff Hollis walked ahead, boots echoing against the concrete floor, while Caleb followed a few paces behind. Steady, deliberate, as though each step pulled another thread of memory loose. Ashfall waited inside the holding pen, a single golden ray of winter sunlight catching along his withers like a faint ember, refusing to die. When Caleb approached, the horse lifted his head, not startled this time, but alert, drawn by something older than the walls between them. "Just a short evaluation," Hollis had said. "We need to document your claim before any hearings take place." Caleb nodded, understanding the procedure, but knowing deep down that the sheriff was wrestling with something beyond paperwork, something that had stirred the moment he saw how Ashfall responded in the ring. Skepticism hadn't left Hollis's eyes, but curiosity now shared the space beside it. The handler unlatched the gate, stepping aside as Caleb entered the pen. The air felt different, warmer somehow, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. Ashfall shifted his weight and let out a low, uncertain rumble. The wind that slipped through the cracked boards carried the faint smell of hay and cold earth, but beneath it Caleb sensed the ghost of summers long gone, distant trails, pine sap, and the rhythm of hooves beating steady ground. He stopped just 5 feet away. No closer. Ashfall's ears twitched forward. "This isn't about showing off," Caleb murmured softly, knowing the horse understood tone far more than words. "It's about remembering." He took in a deep breath, letting it fill his chest, slowly, deliberately, until it met the quiet ache behind his ribs. Then he released it in a slow exhale. 1. He drew in a second breath, steadier, deeper, and let it slip out again in a deliberate stream. 2. The third breath came like a settling of the soul, a bridge between past and present, between the man he was and the man he tried to become after losing everything. 3. Across from him, Ashfall reacted, not dramatically, not like the gasp-inducing moment at the auction, but with a subtle, unmistakable shift. His muscles loosened beneath his dull coat, his neck lowered by a fraction, and his breathing fell into sync with Caleb's, the way it had all those years ago. A murmur of disbelief rose from the two handlers watching nearby. Even Hollis straightened, arms no longer crossed, his expression narrowing in concentration. Caleb slowly extended his open palm, not reaching, not demanding, only offering. Ashfall stepped forward. It wasn't a hesitant shuffle like before. It was a choice, a declaration. He closed the distance between them with a soft exhale that misted into the cold air. When his muzzle brushed Caleb's knuckles, a tremor ran through the older man's hand, part grief, part relief, part something wordless and powerful. He kept his composure, knowing any sudden motion could startle the gelding, but inside his chest, something unmoored and raw threatened to break. "Look at that," one handler whispered. "I'll be damned," another breathed. Hollis approached the railing but didn't interrupt. He seemed almost afraid to break the spell. Caleb shifted gently, bringing himself alongside Ashfall's shoulder. The gelding didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned, just slightly, allowing the familiar presence to settle where it had once belonged. Caleb let his fingers trace the small teardrop-shaped scar under the winter coat, the scar he'd treated countless times during Ashfall's restless youth. The sheriff stepped closer, inspecting the mark. "Well," Hollis murmured, "that's one match." Caleb didn't smile. He kept his eyes on Ashfall, letting the quiet recognition pass between them. A decade of loss had built walls so thick Caleb believed nothing could break through, yet here was a living, breathing truth nudging gently at his sleeve. "Do you see now?" he asked quietly, not turning. "You can't train this. You can't fake it." Hollis didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened in thought, but before he could speak, a sharp noise shattered the stillness, the heavy slam of a barn door thrown open. Owen Briggs strode inside, breath puffing like steam, frustration radiating from every step. He pointed a finger toward the pen. "You've had your fun," Briggs snapped, "but this horse isn't yours." Hollis put a hand up. "Briggs, calm down." "I won't calm down," Briggs shot back. "I've fed him, tended him, paid for him. I don't care how some old cowboy breathes at him. He's mine." Ashfall jerked at the raised voice, shrinking away slightly. Caleb moved instinctively, placing himself between the horse and the outburst, breathing steady, grounding the animal again. Briggs scoffed. "So what now?" Briggs demanded. "You going to let him rewrite ownership because a horse twitches when he breathes?" "He didn't twitch," Hollis replied coldly. "He connected." Briggs threw his hands up. "Connection doesn't win in court. Proof does." Caleb stepped out of the pen, shutting the gate gently behind him. "Then we'll go to court," he said, voice low but unwavering. The barn fell into a heavy silence. Even Briggs seemed taken aback by the firmness in the older man's tone. Hollis nodded once. "The horse stays in county custody until we settle this. No exceptions. We'll set the hearing as soon as possible." Briggs stormed off, muttering about lawyers and fraud. The handlers drifted away, whispering speculation as they left. Only Caleb remained at the gate, one hand resting on the cold metal rail as Ashfall watched him with quiet eyes. "You're not alone anymore," Caleb murmured. "Not this time." Ashfall pressed his muzzle lightly to the bars, breath warming the winter air between them. For the first time in years, Caleb allowed himself to feel something close to hope. Fragile, trembling, but alive. The wind cut sharper the next morning, sweeping through Hartwell Ridge as if trying to carry the tension with it. Caleb returned to the county facility earlier than anyone else, boots crunching over frost-bitten gravel. The sky was pale and cloud-streaked, a quiet warning of storms building somewhere beyond the mountains. He walked toward the barn with a sense of purpose, though the weight of uncertainty pressed into his spine. Today wouldn't be about connection. It would be about conflict, something he had avoided most of his life. Inside, Sheriff Hollis was already there, reviewing documents with a clipboard in hand. His brow creased when he saw Caleb. "You're early," he said. "Hard to sleep," Caleb replied. Hollis gave a sympathetic nod. "Briggs is scheduled to come in. He wants to provide evidence of ownership before the hearing gets set." Caleb didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted to Ashfall's stall, where the gelding stood quietly eating. The horse's ears flicked toward him the moment he appeared, and something inside Caleb eased just a little, like a door cracking open to let in warmth. But peace never lasted long, Footsteps thundered across the barn floor, and Owen Briggs stormed in, coat flapping dramatically, breath short and irritated. He carried a stack of papers tucked under one arm, waving them at Hollis the moment he stopped. "There," Briggs snapped. "Bill of sale, vet notes, feed receipts, everything proving he's mine." Caleb watched silently. The man's frustration wasn't new. Yesterday had already shown him how tightly Briggs held on to the horse, but there was something different today, something strained behind the bluster. Hollis flipped through the documents with professional detachment. "The sale record is real," Hollis said. "No question, but it doesn't address where the horse was before you acquired him." Briggs scoffed. "Doesn't matter. I bought him legally." Caleb finally spoke. "Where did you get him?" "Montana State Auction," Briggs answered curtly. "Horse came through some rescue channel. I don't know. I paid fair money. End of story." Caleb studied him. "And how long have you had him?" "5 years," Briggs said. "Long enough to know he doesn't belong to someone else." The barn fell quiet. Dust motes drifted through the sunlight like drifting embers, echoing memories that neither man wished to voice. Hollis set the documents aside. "Mr. Briggs," Hollis said, "you saw how the horse reacted yesterday. You have to acknowledge that wasn't nothing." Briggs's jaw tightened. "Horses react to calm energy all the time. That cowboy routine doesn't prove ownership." Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "It wasn't a routine. It was a bond we built long before he crossed your path." Briggs spun toward him. "You lost him, didn't you? You let him get swept away. Maybe you should blame yourself, not me." The words hit like a stone flung into a deep well, sharp, sinking fast, disturbing waters Caleb had kept still for years. He inhaled, steadying the ache rising in his chest. "That flood took everything from me," Caleb said quietly. "I didn't have a choice." "Neither did I," Briggs snapped. "You think I have money to spare? You think running a ranch these days is easy? Prices keep climbing. Feed, fencing, insurance, every month is survival. That horse, he's the only thing keeping my land functional. I depend on him." There it was, the truth behind the anger. Briggs wasn't just fighting for pride. He was fighting for survival, grasping at stability the way a drowning man grabs at driftwood. Caleb felt something shift in him, not forgiveness, not agreement, but understanding. Still, understanding didn't change what was true. Caleb motioned toward Ashfall. "If you depend on him so much, why is he so thin?" Briggs stiffened. "He came to me that way. He shouldn't still be that way." For a brief moment, Briggs looked like a man caught in a storm he could no longer outpace. His shoulders sagged, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Then the defensiveness returned, hardening him again. "You can't prove he's yours," Briggs insisted. "Not in a way that matters." Caleb met his gaze directly. "He knows who I am, and I know who he is. That matters." Hollis raised a hand. "Enough, both of you. A judge will make the final call." Briggs straightened and shoved his papers toward Hollis. "Fine. Just make sure the court sees these." "I won't be robbed." He shot one last glare at Caleb, then turned and stomped out of the barn, the door slamming behind him, with a sharp echo that startled Ashfall inside his stall. Caleb winced and stepped toward the horse, offering quiet reassurance with a slow exhale. Ashfall calmed, lowering his head, breath misting in gentle waves. Hollis approached. "You okay?" Caleb nodded, though his expression remained heavy. "He's not wrong," he said softly. "That flood, I did lose him." "That doesn't mean you gave up on him," Hollis replied. "Everyone in this town knows what that storm did. No one could have held on." Caleb didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Ashfall, absorbing the horse's presence, not just as an animal, but as a testament to loss, to survival, to unfinished stories. Hollis placed the documents under his arm. "I'm scheduling the hearing today. With what I've seen so far, the judge will want more than paperwork." Caleb nodded. "I'll be ready." He reached out, and Ashfall leaned forward, touching his nose carefully to Caleb's sleeve, like a reminder that their bond hadn't eroded under time's weight. Like a promise. Outside, wind swept across Hartwell Ridge, rattling loose boards and carrying the faint scent of snow. Caleb stepped onto the porch of the barn and let the cold air hit him full force. This fight wouldn't be easy. Some battles never were. But he had begun a journey he couldn't walk away from, not again, not when the past had stirred itself awake and come walking toward him on 4 weary legs. He rested both hands on the railing, breathing deep, the sharp winter air cutting but clarifying. "Hold on," he whispered, eyes drifting toward the mountains. "Just a little longer." The afternoon sun sat low behind the mountains when Caleb returned to the rescue barn later that same day. The cold had softened, drifting into that brief, golden hour when winter light warms just enough to cast illusions of spring. Caleb wanted to spend a quiet moment with Ashfall. No arguments, no legal tension, just space to breathe. But when he stepped through the sliding barn door, he noticed immediately that he wasn't alone. A woman stood near Ashfall's stall, one hand lightly gripping the railing as she watched the gelding with a softness that didn't belong to strangers. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping to catch the drifting sunlight. She wore a weatherproof jacket dusted with trail dirt, the kind favored by photographers and hikers. Something about her presence held a quiet gravity. Not disruptive, simply there. Ashfall, curious but calm, had his head lowered close to her hand, as though he recognized a gentleness in her. Caleb slowed his steps. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman turned, her expression shifting from concentration to something like relief. "You must be Caleb Mercer," she said. "Sheriff Hollis told me I might find you here." Her voice carried the same steady tone as someone accustomed to wilderness silence. She stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Lila Carter." Caleb hesitated before shaking her hand. "Do we know each other?" "No," she said softly. "But I knew the horse." A quiet settled around them. Caleb felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. "Ashfall?" he asked, barely breathing the word. She nodded. "We called him Ember." He almost laughed, one startled breath that never fully formed. "Ember," he repeated. "Why that name?" "Because of the streak in his coat," she said, glancing at Ashfall. "It looked like a burning coal in the right light. My daughter loved it." Caleb's heart skipped. "Your daughter?" Lila reached into her pack and removed a small envelope, worn around the edges, handled too many times to count. She opened it carefully and pulled out a photograph. A faded print, slightly warped from moisture, showing a young girl in a raincoat, clinging to a horse drenched in mud and river water. Ember, Ashfall, stood shielding her, body angled as if he were bracing against the storm itself. Caleb's breath caught. Where was this taken? 5 years ago, Lila said, voice threaded with lingering emotion. There was a flash flood in Wren Hollow. My daughter, Abigail, got swept from the trail. Ember found her, stood over her until the rescue team got there. The barn felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had pulled in to listen. I never knew where he came from, Lila continued, brushing her thumb over the photo, or who he belonged to. He was thin when he arrived in our valley, skittish but brave. My husband and I sheltered him for a few weeks until a man came claiming ownership, Briggs. He said he was boarding the horse while moving stock. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He wasn't. I know that now, she said. Ember didn't want to go with him, but we didn't have proof to stop it. She swallowed, shoulders trembling for the first time, and I've regretted it ever since. Caleb took the photograph gently from her hand. Ember, Ashfall, looked so different in it. Still thin but bright-eyed. Alive. A horse with purpose instead of fear. He'd survived the flood, survived the years after, survived Briggs. And somehow, impossibly, he'd saved a child along the way. He was always like that, Caleb whispered. Courage hidden under quiet. Lila studied him with softened eyes. You trained him well. Whoever taught him to stand between danger and a child, they did something extraordinary. Caleb exhaled slowly. It wasn't training, not exactly. Horses don't learn courage. They learn trust. Lila nodded with a thoughtful sadness. Abigail has a photo of Ember on her nightstand to this day. She still talks about him like he's a legend. The thought warmed Caleb more deeply than he expected. I'm glad he gave her something good to remember. He did more than that, she said. He gave her back to me. Silence settled again, heavier this time, weighted with gratitude, memory, and the rawness of what-ifs. Then Lila reached back into her pack. There's something else. She pulled out a small flash drive. This contains the video footage from that rescue. It's blurry, and the audio is ruined, but you can see Ember clearly, and you can see what he did. Caleb stared. Why bring this to me? Because you're fighting for him, she said simply. And that horse deserves someone who sees him, really sees him. Her words settled into him like warm embers in a cold hearth. Oh. He accepted the flash drive, feeling the weight of it, small yet heavier than anything Briggs could wave in court. Lila took a step toward Ashfall's stall again. The horse reached out, nudging her gently, as if acknowledging the past they shared. You're going to win this, she said softly to Caleb, not because the court will say so, but because the truth is already choosing sides. Caleb looked at Ashfall through the bars, the horse's dark eyes reflecting the thin gold of sunset. I lost him once, he whispered. I won't lose him again. Lila nodded and started toward the barn door, pausing just before stepping outside. I'll testify. Whatever you need, I'll be there. Then she left, boots crunching over gravel as the winter air swept in her place. Caleb stood quietly after she left, the photo still warm in his hand. Ashfall shifted closer, resting his muzzle against the bars. The past had returned, not to haunt him, but to help him fight. For the first time in 10 years, the future didn't look hollow. It looked possible. The courthouse in Hartwell Ridge wasn't grand by any measure, just a 2-story brick building tucked between the post office and an insurance office advertising accident coverage and legal protection in bright red letters. On most days, it handled small disputes, property lines, traffic violations, the occasional ranch quarrel. But today the air inside buzzed with a strange, quiet tension. People who rarely attended public hearings had shown up early, bundled in jackets, whispering among themselves as the rows filled. Caleb arrived with Sheriff Hollis, who carried a folder thick with documents. Lila Carter waited near the front, hands clasped tightly, her gaze steady but nervous. She offered Caleb a small, reassuring nod. He returned it, though inside his chest felt tight. He'd faced danger before, storms, wild horses, the crushing loneliness of grief. But this was different. This was something he couldn't muscle through or quietly endure. This required words, evidence, truth taken for it and examined under fluorescent lights. A bailiff called for order, and Judge Ellen Markham, composed, silver-haired, eyes sharp as winter sunlight, stepped up to the bench. We are here to review the custody claim involving one gelding identified as Ashfall, she announced. Claimant Caleb Mercer asserts prior ownership and seeks return of said animal. Counterclaim by Owen Briggs contests this. We will hear testimony and examine all evidence. Briggs rose first, dressed in clothes too formal for him, his discomfort showing in the stiff way he adjusted his tie. His lawyer, a younger man with polished shoes and a salesman's confidence, began with the usual legal language. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of possession. Mr. Briggs purchased the horse at a state-sanctioned fee that establishes legal ownership. The attorney placed documents on the table with theatrical precision. Here are the bills of sale, feed receipts, veterinary notes, all legitimate, all dated. Whispers drifted through the crowd. Caleb stood still, shoulders squared, gaze calm. He didn't argue, didn't shift. He had learned over years of hardship that the truth didn't need volume, it needed room. Judge Markham reviewed the stack. Documents are in order, she said, but they only verify ownership from 5 years ago. We need clarity on what came before. The lawyer smirked slightly. With respect, Your Honor, the animal's earlier history is irrelevant. Absent documentation, the law favors the current owner. Hollis cleared his throat, not loudly, but just enough to break the attorney's rhythm. Your Honor, if I may. Judge Markham gestured for him to proceed. Hollis stepped forward. I personally witnessed an unusual interaction between Mr. Mercer and the horse. Not a trick, not a coincidence. A bond. He chose the word carefully. I've worked livestock all my life. I know what a trained reaction looks like. This wasn't that. The horse recognized him, deeply, instinctively. Briggs scoffed, but the judge held up a hand. Mr. Briggs, refrain from interruption. The sheriff handed over his report. Additionally, a scar identified by Mr. Mercer matches the one he described, a teardrop-shaped mark on the left shoulder. A mark anyone could notice, Briggs muttered. Not if you weren't looking for it, Hollis replied coolly. Judge Markham leaned back, considering. We will hear from the next witness. Lila stood. Her hands trembled slightly, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. 5 years ago, during a flood, this horse saved my daughter's life. A stillness settled over the courtroom, deep and absolute. Lila continued, her eyes fixed on the judge. He protected her, stood between her and the water. He didn't run. He sheltered her like he understood. Afterward, he stayed with us for weeks. She drew a breath, memories shifting through her expression like shadows. He was thin, frightened, but gentle. My husband and I cared for him until Mr. Briggs claimed him. The attorney stood. Mrs. Carter, did you verify ownership at the time? No, she admitted. We didn't know how. We trusted the man who came with the paperwork. Her honesty carried no excuses, only truth. She reached into her coat and withdrew the flash drive, offering it to the bailiff. There is video footage from the rescue. You can see the horse clearly. The judge watched the screen as the grainy footage played. A child clinging to a rock in a dirty torrent of water. A gelding pushing through the current, planting his legs against the flow, positioning himself like a living barrier. Gasps filled the courtroom. Even Briggs looked away briefly, jaw tightening. The judge's gaze shifted to Caleb. Mr. Mercer, she said, do you claim that this horse acted this way because of your training? Caleb shook his head. No, ma'am, not training, just the kind of heart he's always had. The simplicity of the answer seemed to move something in the room. The judge folded her hands. And what proof do you offer of prior ownership? Caleb inhaled slowly. The silence waiting for his response felt thick, expectant. He reached into his jacket, not for papers, but for the faded photograph of Ashfall from decades ago. Marin's photograph. He placed it before the judge. That's him before the flood, Caleb said quietly, before everything went wrong. I never stopped looking for him. Not once. The judge examined the photo, then glanced between Caleb and the man in the image, broad-shouldered, younger, smiling. Time had carved deep lines across his face since then, but the eyes were unmistakably the same. A long breath drifted through the room. "I see," she murmured. The lawyer for Briggs stepped forward. "But none of this is concrete evidence of ownership. Emotional testimony cannot override documentation." The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Caleb again. "One question, Mr. Mercer." He met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Why fight for him after all this time?" The question dropped like a stone into the center of the room. Quiet. Heavy, impossible to ignore. Caleb swallowed. "Because he's family," he said. "Because everything I've loved that could walk away already has. And he didn't walk. He was torn from me by a storm I couldn't stop." His voice deepened but never cracked. "You don't abandon family." A hush swept the courtroom, raw and thick with emotion. Judge Markham set her pen down. Her expression gave nothing away, but there was something in her eyes, something softened, something human. "I will schedule a field evaluation," she said at last. "We will observe the horse's behavioral response to both parties. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck once, echoing across the wooden benches. As people rose from their seats, whispers rippled through the room, some astonished, some skeptical, many moved. Caleb exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of battle settling deeper onto his shoulders. But when he looked toward Lila and Hollis, both nodding reassurances, and then toward Ashfall waiting somewhere beyond those walls, he knew one thing for certain. The truth had finally been heard. The field evaluation was set for late afternoon, when the sun hung low enough to pour warm light across the county rescue paddock. Winter had softened that day, loosening its grip just enough for the snow to turn slushy underfoot. The sky was streaked with copper and rose, colors that seemed to echo the tension in Caleb's chest as he walked beside Sheriff Hollis toward the fenced arena. A handful of townspeople had gathered, drawn by curiosity, sympathy, or simply the promise of a story unfolding in real time. Lila stood quietly near the gate, hands clasped in her coat pockets, offering Caleb a look that carried reassurance without a single word. On the opposite end, Owen Briggs leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, jaw set tight. The cold wind tugged at the edges of his coat, but his expression stayed rigid, almost brittle, like someone holding on to the last thing keeping his world upright. Inside the arena, Ashfall waited, his head lifted at the sight of movement, ears pricking forward with a flicker of alertness. The gelding had been brushed for the evaluation, and though he was still thin, the light caught a faint shimmer along his coat, like embers glowing beneath ash. Caleb's breath hitched. The horse looked more alive today, as if the promise of recognition had stirred something inside him. Judge Markham arrived moments later, notebook in hand. Her gaze swept across the arena, absorbing the atmosphere, the witnesses, the solemn anticipation. She stepped up to the rail. "This evaluation," she announced, "is not a legal decision. It is an observation to aid in determining the horse's behavioral alignment and history. Each party will have equal time to interact." Briggs's lawyer nodded stiffly. Caleb simply swallowed once, steadying himself. "Mr. Briggs," the judge said, "you may go first." Briggs pushed off the fence and entered the arena with exaggerated confidence. The moment his boots touched the dirt, Ashfall stiffened, shifting sideways. Briggs extended a hand, murmuring something meant to sound soothing, but his energy carried strain, sharp, impatient. Ashfall blew out a loud breath and backed away. Briggs tried again, attempting to circle the horse, but the gelding evaded him, nostrils flaring. "He's just skittish," Briggs muttered loudly. "Horse has always been high-strung." Judge Markham's pen hovered. She wrote something down, expression unchanged. Briggs tried once more, approaching with firmer steps as though trying to assert control. Ashfall responded instantly, turning his head sharply away, muscles tight beneath his coat. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," the judge said evenly. "That will do." Briggs exhaled hard, frustration sharpening the edges of his posture as he left the arena. Judge Markham shifted her attention. "Mr. Mercer, your turn." Caleb stepped forward, boots sinking into the damp earth. The arena felt enormous as he crossed it, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. He paused halfway in, giving Ashfall space, letting the silence settle. The gelding lifted his head again, ears flicking toward him, with a slow, dawning familiarity. Caleb breathed once, deep and steady. Ashfall blinked. He breathed again, slower this time, letting the memory of old trails and quiet mornings fill the space between them. Ashfall lowered his head. The third breath came naturally, like a prayer whispered in rhythm with the land itself. Ashfall stepped toward him. A hush swept over the spectators. Even the wind seemed to pause as the gelding closed the distance in measured, instinctive strides. Caleb extended his palm, not insisting, only offering. Ashfall brushed his muzzle across Caleb's hand, warm breath spilling into the cooling air. The softness of it nearly brought Caleb to his knees. He moved closer, placing his palm gently along the horse's cheekbone. Ashfall leaned into the touch, eyes half closing with a trust deeper than time. "He remembers," Lila whispered from the fence line, voice thick with emotion. But it wasn't just recognition. It was something stronger. Ashfall shifted again, stepping beside Caleb, positioning himself the way he once did when they rode narrow mountain paths, the way he instinctively aligned with the man who had been his anchor through storms both literal and otherwise. Judge Markham scribbled notes quickly now, her brows tightening in concentration. Caleb walked a slow circle. Ashfall followed, not trained obedience, not forced compliance. A bond, a living thread woven through a decade of separation, pulled taut again in the fading light. Briggs's frustration erupted then. "This is ridiculous. Horses follow whoever they think has food. He's just reacting to familiarity in the arena." Caleb didn't turn. Instead, he stopped and let his arms fall gently to his sides, a posture Ashfall once knew as rest. The gelding mirrored him, relaxing fully, letting out a long, unguarded sigh that shivered through the quiet. Judge Markham lifted her gaze. "Mr. Briggs," she said firmly, "this is not about food." Caleb placed a final soft touch on Ashfall's neck, fingers brushing over the faint teardrop scar that Judge Markham had inspected earlier. Ashfall pressed his head into Caleb's shoulder, the gesture unmistakably intimate, a reunion written without words. Caleb whispered, "I'm here, boy," and Ashfall's whole body loosened in recognition. The sunlight slipped lower, draping the arena in gold. Judge Markham closed her notebook. "Thank you. This observation is complete. Court will convene tomorrow for formal ruling." She stepped back from the railing, her expression thoughtful, but there was no mistaking the shift in her eyes. Something had changed. As the crowd filtered out, murmuring about what they'd witnessed, Caleb slipped a hand along Ashfall's neck once more. The horse leaned gently toward him, just enough for Caleb to understand what the moment meant. Not hope, not possibility. Truth. A truth that had survived storms, distance, loss, and time. A truth standing tall in the falling light. The ruling came the next morning. Snow drifted lightly over Hartwell Ridge as Sheriff Hollis knocked on Caleb's cabin door, breath fogging in the icy air. Caleb opened it before Hollis even spoke. Something in the sheriff's eyes already told him what he needed to know. "It's done," Hollis said. "Judge Markham ruled in your favor. Ashfall is yours." For a moment, Caleb couldn't find words. Relief didn't come in a rush. It came in a slow, trembling wave, like warmth pushing through long-frozen blood. He gripped the edge of the doorframe to steady himself. "He's mine," Caleb whispered. Then louder, as though testing, the truth aloud, "He's really coming home." Hollis nodded, a rare smile easing the tension in his features. "We'll release him this afternoon. I'll help you transport him." Caleb swallowed hard, a grateful breath escaping him. "Thank you, Mark." But Hollis shook his head. "Don't thank me. I just followed what I saw." He paused. "And what I saw, well, some things don't need laws to explain." By afternoon, the clouds thinned just enough to let sunlight shimmer over the rescue facility. The crowd was smaller today, only a handful of locals who felt drawn back to witness the final chapter of the tale unfolding in their town. Briggs was nowhere in sight. Whether from shame or exhaustion, he didn't return. Caleb couldn't decide if he felt sorry for the man or relieved the conflict had ended quietly. Ashfall stood in the paddock, his coat catching small flecks of snow. The horse turned when Caleb approached, ears pricking forward in that unmistakable way, recognition blooming like a lantern in the dark. Caleb stepped to the gate and opened it. No ceremony, no hesitation. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's go home." Ashfall walked to him as though he had walked that path 1,000 times. Caleb ran a hand along the gelding's neck, feeling the warmth beneath winter hair. The contact grounded him, pulling him into the present, a moment he once thought he'd never live to see. Hollis helped secure the trailer, adjusting straps with practiced efficiency. "He'll need time," he said. "Nutrition, farrier work, rest. But he's a survivor." Caleb smiled faintly. "Always has been." Lila arrived then, bundled in her forest green coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She approached with a mixture of joy and farewell in her eyes. "I heard the news," she said, brushing a hand over Ashfall's nose. "Congratulations, Caleb." He nodded, emotions thickening his voice. "Couldn't have done it without you." Lila gave a small, sad smile. "Abigail will want to visit him sometime. She'll be happy knowing he found his way back." "He'll be here," Caleb promised, "if she ever wants to see him again." Lila stepped forward and unexpectedly wrapped him in a gentle hug. It was brief, respectful, but something inside Caleb softened at the human warmth he hadn't felt in years. When she stepped back, she touched Ashfall's cheek one last time. "Take care of him," she whispered. "I will," Caleb replied, "and he'll take care of me." As she walked away, her boots crunching in the snow, Hollis cleared his throat. "She's right, you know. Horse like that doesn't come around twice in a man's life." Caleb's lips curved in a quiet, humbled smile. "Neither do people like her." They loaded Ashfall carefully, and Caleb made the slow drive home, with the sheriff following behind. The winding road looked different today, still steeped in winter, but no longer bleak. Caleb glanced into the trailer through the small rear window now and then, watching the faint movement of the horse shifting for balance. When they reached his property, the world felt still and expectant. The small barn near the edge of the pasture had been cleaned and prepared earlier. Fresh straw laid out, water trough filled, hinges oiled. Caleb swung open the trailer door. "Easy now," he murmured. Ashfall stepped down, hooves pressing into familiar earth he hadn't touched in a decade. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he breathed in the scents of pine, cold soil, old lumber. Memories stirred in both of them, trembling but alive. Caleb unclipped the lead rope and let the horse stand freely in the yard. Ashfall turned slowly, surveying the landscape, ears rotating like antennae picking up signals from a long-lost world. Caleb watched without speaking, tears stinging but refusing to fall. This was not a moment to clutter with words. The gelding took a few tentative steps toward the barn, then a few more, and finally, as though some deep recognition unlocked inside him, Ashfall walked with certainty to the open stall. the stall that had once been his. Caleb followed, leaning a hand against the wooden frame, breath shaking. "You remember," he whispered. Ashfall lowered his head into the hay, not greedily, but peacefully, like a creature laying down a heavy burden at last. Hollis stepped up beside Caleb. "I'll leave you two alone," he said. Caleb nodded. "Thank you for everything." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You take care of him. And yourself." When the truck pulled away and silence reclaimed the ridge, Caleb stepped fully into the stall. Ashfall lifted his head and moved toward him, pressing his forehead gently against Caleb's chest. Caleb closed his eyes, resting a hand along the gelding's crest. "Welcome home," he whispered. The wind outside softened. The world felt less empty. The future, for the first time in years, felt like something he could walk toward. Not alone, with Ashfall beside him. The first hints of spring crept over Hartwell Ridge in delicate strokes, thin blades of grass piercing through softened snow, drifts melting into silver puddles along the pasture fence, the air carrying a faint earthy sweetness instead of winter's bite. Caleb stepped out of the cabin at dawn, tugging his jacket tighter as a pale mist curled across the field. Today marked 3 months since Ashfall had come home, and every day between then and now had reshaped Caleb in ways he never expected. He walked toward the barn, with slow, steady purpose. Ashfall stood waiting at the stall door as if he had sensed Caleb rising before the sun itself. The gelding's coat no longer looked dull. It shimmered with a quiet strength, the faint ash-colored streak along his neck glowing in the warm hue of morning. His eyes had regained the alert, steady focus Caleb once knew so well, eyes that searched the world, not for danger, but for connection. "Good morning, boy," Caleb murmured, running a hand along Ashfall's cheek. The horse leaned in, not urgently, but with a gentle certainty, as though anchoring himself to the man he had finally returned to. Caleb smiled, pressing his forehead softly against Ashfall's for a few seconds, a brief but grounding ritual of greeting that had grown naturally between them. Outside, the sky warmed to shades of apricot and gold. Caleb opened the stall door and stepped back as Ashfall walked into the paddock, hooves brushing damp earth. The gelding paused at the gate, waiting, not out of hesitation, but habit. Waiting for Caleb to walk beside him, as they'd begun doing each morning along the short ridge trail behind the property. Caleb clicked the latch open. "All right," he said, "let's go stretch those legs." They walked slowly toward the hill path, Ashfall's steps matching Caleb's without the need for a rope. The world was quiet, except for the occasional call of a magpie across the valley and the soft crunch of their steps on thawing ground. Caleb breathed deeply, letting the cold morning air fill his chest, cleansing him in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Halfway up the ridge, Caleb paused to rest his hand against a weathered fence post. This spot had once been a lookout he often visited with Marin and their son, back when the world felt full and unbroken. Those memories had carved wounds so deep he believed nothing could grow from them again. But as Ashfall stood beside him now, nudging his shoulder gently, Caleb felt something shift. Not the sting of loss, but the warmth of remembrance, a softness instead of a wound. "You know," Caleb said quietly, "I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again." His voice wavered, but not from sorrow, rather from the surprise of speaking truth aloud. "I thought life was something I watched pass by, not something I lived." Ashfall flicked an ear, listening in that way horses do when they're not just hearing sound, but sensing emotion. Caleb chuckled softly at the gesture. "You saved me, too," he admitted, "not just back then, but now." A breeze brushed across them, carrying the crisp scent of pine. Ashfall shifted forward, and Caleb followed him up the last incline, boots grounding into the soft dirt until they reached the overlook. Below them, Hartwell Ridge sprawled out in morning quiet, ranches, winding fences, glistening ponds, and the faint smoke of early fires rising from chimneys. It was a place that had once felt too empty for him, too heavy with ghosts. Now, it felt like home returned. Caleb exhaled a trembling breath, and for the first time in a decade, it didn't hurt. He turned toward Ashfall. "You're free now," he said softly. "You can run this whole ridge if you want to." He opened the paddock gate that bordered the overlook meadow. Ashfall stepped through it, head lifting, as the wind tousled. His mane. For a moment, Caleb wondered if the horse would sprint across the fields, disappearing into the wild expanse as creatures born of open country sometimes do. And part of him believed Ashfall had earned that freedom. But the gelding didn't run. Instead, he turned, slow, deliberate, and walked back toward Caleb, lowering his head until their foreheads touched. That simple gesture, warm and steady, said everything words never could. Caleb's breath caught. "All right then," he whispered. "We stay together." They walked back down the ridge side by side, moving with the quiet rhythm of beings who had survived too much to take companionship for granted. When they reached the barn, Caleb lingered beside Ashfall a moment longer, scratching the horse's neck where he liked it most. The gelding leaned in with unmistakable affection, a reminder that though time had carved long shadows through their lives, it had not erased the bond forged between them. From the cabin porch, the valley spread before them, open, bright, and waiting. Caleb felt the weight of loneliness slip from his shoulders like melting snow. The world had changed, yes, but so had he. And Ashfall had taught him that even after devastation, life had a way of finding new footing, of rising again. "You ready to start fresh?" Caleb asked. Ashfall answered with a soft nicker, warm breath curling into the cool morning air. Caleb smiled, genuine, unguarded, and whole. The road ahead wasn't long or short. It wasn't easy or difficult. It was simply theirs. Two survivors stitched together not by circumstance, but by choice. Together they stepped into the new day. And at last, the long closed chapter of loss folded gently into one of hope. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. There are many more journeys waiting for you.